The day of my mother's funeral was meant to be one of mourning. But when everyone left, my stepfather locked the door and said, "Now you're going to give me the son your mother never could." That day, I understood that my mother's last breath had been to save me. Hello, my dear friends. What a blessing to be able to chat with you today. I'm Alice Teresa Williams, 73 years young, and I live in Lakeside, Montana. You know, life has its ways. When I was young, I never imagined I'd be here one day, opening my heart to so many people through a little device like this. I'm a retired psychologist, but I still counsel some folks here in the community, especially women who've gone through difficult situations. I have a special corner in my home, a cozy little room with 2 brown leather armchairs that my late husband gave me as a gift when I graduated, already at 42 years old. There, between one conversation and another, over a cup of coffee or some sweet tea, I help these people find their inner strength, just as I found mine. I started helping others by chance. After I graduated, I set up a small office downtown. At first, it was just to supplement the family income, but I soon realized that each story I heard, each tear I wiped away, was like a piece of my own story being healed. As we say here in Montana, those who warm others warm themselves in life's winter. I'm sitting here on my porch with a view of the Flathead River just down below, my birds singing in the garden, and the smell of my freshly brewed coffee beside me. From here, I can see the steeple of the church where I married my dear Thomas. May he rest in peace. I have a peaceful life now, thank God. Before I continue my story, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're enjoying this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps this grandma continue sharing her stories with you. And you, my dear friends who are watching me now, tell me in the comments, from which little town are you watching? And what time of day did you find this video? Early morning with your coffee after lunch? Or perhaps at nightfall when the shadows start to creep in? I always read all the comments, and I'm so happy to know where you're from and when you take a moment out of your day to listen to this grandma's stories. Let me know, okay? Let's create a chain of kindness. Today, I'm going to tell you a difficult but necessary story. A story about how sometimes, even in the darkest moment of our lives, a light can appear. And how sometimes that light comes from the most unexpected place. I'm going to tell you about the day I lost my mother and almost lost much more than that. I was born in Riverdale, a small town in Montana, in a simple but love-filled home. My mother, Dorothy Williams, was a seamstress and embroiderer. Fairy hands, as they said in town. She made the most beautiful wedding dresses in the region, and often stayed up late, bent over those white fabrics, sewing dreams with her calloused hands. My father, Joseph, worked at the railroad station. He was a quiet man, of few words, but with kind eyes. I remember him coming home with his uniform always impeccable, smelling of locomotive smoke and bringing small surprises in his pockets. A maple candy wrapped in wax paper, a colorful ribbon for my hair, a new story to tell before bedtime. It was just the 3 of us in the small wooden house on Maple Street. My parents tried to have more children, but God wanted me to be an only child. This made me the center of attention, the apple of both their eyes. My father always said, "Alice is small in size but big in heart." And it was true, I was always tiny, but with an energy that couldn't be contained. Our routine was simple. We would wake up with the roosters crowing, still in the dark. My mother would light the wood stove, and soon the smell of fresh coffee would fill the house. My father would leave early for the station, and I would help my mother organize the fabrics and threads before going to school. In the afternoon, after classes, I would play in the yard with the other neighborhood children, Celeste, Ben, and Martha, while my mother sewed on the porch, always keeping an eye on us. We would play hide-and-seek among the trees, jump rope with pieces of sisal that my father brought from the station, and on rainy days, we would gather under the porch to play jacks with little stones we collected from the river. In winter, which was harsh in Riverdale, my mother made mulled cider for the adults and hot chocolate for us children. We would all sit around the wood stove, listening to the scary stories that Ben's father told about the headless horseman and Bigfoot. It was a happy childhood, even with little. My father liked to take me to see the trains arriving and departing from the station. I was fascinated by those iron giants, huffing and releasing steam, bringing people from distant places I didn't even know existed. "One day you'll be able to travel wherever you want, Alice," he would say, pointing to the tracks that seemed endless. But our simple happiness didn't last forever. When I was 9 years old, on a cold July morning, my father didn't come home after work. There was an accident at the station. A car derailed during a maneuver. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all very quick, his colleagues said. He didn't suffer, they tried to console my mother. But she suffered. We suffered. The funeral was at St. Peter's Church, the same one where I had been baptized. I remember the closed casket, the fine rain that wouldn't stop falling, my mother's hands squeezing mine so tightly they hurt. But I didn't complain. I knew she needed to hold on to something to keep from falling apart right there. The following years were difficult. My mother started sewing even more, accepting any order to support us. I helped as I could, delivering the finished clothes, organizing the materials, even learning some basic embroidery stitches. Our nights became silent without my father's stories. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and find my mother crying quietly over her sewing, thinking I wouldn't notice. That's when Anthony entered our lives. He showed up at our door one day, wanting to order a shirt for a wedding. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to fill our small living room. He had well-trimmed gray hair and always wore shoes polished to a shine. A cattle dealer, he traveled throughout the region. He came back several times, always with a new order for my mother. And soon, it wasn't just for the sewing that he returned. At first, he seemed kind. He brought gifts, a fine piece of fabric for my mother, a porcelain doll for me. He praised her work, said he had never seen such talented hands. For me, he brought gumdrops from the big city and told stories of his travels. But there was something in his gaze that bothered me, even at that age. When he looked at my mother, his eyes shone in a strange way, as if she were one of the cows he traded at fairs. Gradually, Anthony occupied more and more space in our lives. He started having dinner with us regularly, then spending Sundays at our house. He fixed broken things, replaced the tiles that let water in when it rained hard, painted the peeling walls. My mother smiled again, and that was good to see. But for me, something didn't seem right. It was as if a shadow had entered our house along with him. When I was 12, my mother called me for a serious conversation. Anthony had proposed to her, and she had accepted. "We're going to move to Lakeside, where he has a bigger house," she explained, her eyes shining with a hope I hadn't seen since my father was alive. "You'll have your own room, you'll go to a better school. We'll have a new chance, sweetheart." I wanted to be happy for her, but part of me felt we were betraying my father's memory. And there was that uneasiness whenever Anthony was around, something I couldn't explain, but that made my stomach tighten. However, seeing my mother's smile after so much suffering, I swallowed my fears and tried to convince myself that everything would be all right. The wedding was simple, at the town church, with just a few close friends and Anthony's relatives. Soon after, we packed our bags and moved to Lakeside. The house was indeed bigger, made of brick, with a backyard where tangerine trees grew and a small garden that my mother soon filled with daisies and geraniums. I had my own room with a window overlooking the street. I could take my books and my doll collection, including the porcelain one Anthony had given me. At first, everything seemed like a dream. Anthony was attentive to my mother, brought gifts from his trips, made plans for the future. But gradually, I began to notice changes. Small at first, almost imperceptible, like the way he criticized the seasoning of the food, or how he frowned when my mother talked to a neighbor. It was when I turned 13 that things began to get really different. And neither I nor my mother could imagine how much our life would change from then on. I remember my 13th birthday, as if it were yesterday. My mother, even with her health not very good, had prepared an orange cake with chocolate frosting, my favorite. We sang Happy Birthday, just the three of us at the kitchen table. Anthony gave me a new pair of shoes, the kind for young ladies with a small heel. "You're becoming a young lady now, Alice," he said, with a look that sent a shiver down my spine. It was around that time that I began to notice how his eyes followed me around the house. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. After all, he was married to my mother. He was like a father to me, wasn't he? But there was something in that look that made me feel dirty, as if I were doing something wrong, even when I was just reading a book or helping my mother in the kitchen. That same month, my mother began to complain of back pains. At first, we thought it was just fatigue. She spent hours bent over her sewing, even after we moved to Lakeside. Anthony said she didn't need to work so much, that his money was enough for all of us, but she insisted. "I need to feel useful," she said. And deep down, I think she liked having her own income, her independence. The pains got worse. Soon, she couldn't sit for long periods. The town doctor, Dr. Oswald, diagnosed a spine problem that would need treatment in Minneapolis. It was the first time I saw Anthony really angry. "So much money wasted," he shouted after the doctor left. My mother cried in hiding that night. Even so, we went to Minneapolis for the consultations. Anthony took us reluctantly, complaining about every cent spent. In the big hospital, with corridors that seemed endless, we discovered that the problem was more serious than we thought. It wasn't just the spine. There was something growing inside her, something bad that the doctor explained with complicated words that I, at 13, didn't fully understand. But I understood enough to know that my mother was very ill. The following months were filled with trips to and from Minneapolis. Anthony grew increasingly irritated with the expenses and the time he spent driving on the highway. At home, the atmosphere became heavy. My mother lost weight. Her beautiful face became pale, her eyes without the sparkle they once had. She tried to hide the pain, especially in front of Anthony, but I could hear her moaning softly during the night. It was during this time that Anthony began to drink more. He would come home late, smelling of whiskey and cigarettes. He would argue about anything. The house wasn't clean enough, the food was cold, she had spent too much on medicines. My mother, already too weak to defend herself, would just lower her head and accept the insults. This infuriated me, but I didn't have the courage to stand up to him either. One night, I woke up to strange noises coming from their bedroom. Anthony was shouting, saying horrible things to my mother. "What good is a woman who's good for nothing? You couldn't even give me a son. All you do is spend money on doctors." I heard the sound of something breaking, and then my mother's muffled crying. I wanted to go there, to defend her, but fear paralyzed me. I lay curled up in my bed, tears silently streaming down my face, hating myself for being such a coward. The next morning, my mother appeared with a bruise on her face. She said she had tripped in the dark. Anthony drank his coffee in silence, not looking at either of us, and left for work as if nothing had happened. As soon as he closed the door, I ran to hug my mother. "Let's get out of here," I begged. She just stroked my hair and smiled a sad smile. "It's not that simple, honey." Where would we go? With what money? He wasn't always like this. It's just a difficult phase. But it wasn't a phase. It was who he really was, without the masks he wore when he met us, and things only got worse. Alcohol became a constant presence, the arguments more frequent, the bruises on my mother harder to hide, and to my horror, Anthony's gaze on me became increasingly insistent, more disturbing. One afternoon, I came home from school and found the house strangely silent. My mother wasn't in the sewing room, nor in the kitchen. I called for her and got no response. With my heart racing, I went to their bedroom and found her lying down, paler than ever, breathing with difficulty. "Mom!" I shouted, running to her side. She slowly opened her eyes and whispered, "It's okay, honey. I just need to rest a bit." I ran to call Dr. Oswald. He came immediately, and after examining my mother, his face assumed that grave expression that doctors have when the news isn't good. We needed to take her to the hospital in Minneapolis as soon as possible. I tried to contact Anthony at the agricultural equipment store where he worked when he wasn't traveling, but they said he had gone out for lunch. In fact, I found out later he was at the bar. Dr. Oswald, seeing my desperation, offered to take us in his own car. I packed a small suitcase for my mother, and the three of us departed. During the journey, she held my hand tightly, as if trying to absorb all my young energy. "Alice," she said at one point, her voice almost a whisper. "Promise me you'll be strong, no matter what happens," I promised, without fully understanding what she meant. At the hospital, she was quickly taken inside. I stayed in the waiting room with Dr. Oswald, who tried to calm me down. Hours later, Anthony arrived, smelling of alcohol, demanding to know why we had left without telling him. The doctor explained the situation, and he seemed to calm down a bit, though his eyes revealed more irritation than concern. My mother stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. The cancer, it was the first time I heard that terrible word, was too advanced. The doctors did what they could, but the chances were minimal. I would visit her every day after school. Anthony would take me reluctantly, grumbling about the money he was throwing down the drain. During one of these visits, my mother asked to be alone with me. She was even thinner, her eyes sunken in their sockets, but there was an urgency in her gaze that frightened me. "Alice," she whispered, holding my hand with surprising strength for someone so debilitated. "I need you to listen carefully." She then told me about Helen, Anthony's first wife. "He never told you about her, but they were married for 7 years. She left him because he wasn't a good man, Alice. I didn't know that when we got married. I only found out afterward." My mother swallowed hard, her eyes teary. "Helen lives in Star Valley now. I wrote down her phone number in my little sewing notebook, the one with the blue cover with flowers. If anything happens to me, if you need help, look for her." I didn't fully understand why she was telling me this. Why would I need to look for my stepfather's ex-wife? But I promised I would do as she asked. It was the least I could do, seeing her suffer that way. The following week, the doctors suggested we take my mother home. "There's nothing more we can do here," they said, with that professional compassion that barely disguises their helplessness. "She'll be more comfortable in her own home." The journey back was silent. My mother, sedated to endure the pain of the trip, slept in the back seat of the car, with her head on my lap. Anthony drove in silence, his expression closed. From time to time, I caught him observing me in the rearview mirror, and that look made my blood run cold. When we arrived home, Anthony helped carry my mother to the bedroom. It was one of the rare moments of kindness I witnessed in the last few months. But as soon as he laid her on the bed, he left saying he needed to take care of some business. He returned late, smelling of alcohol as usual. The days that followed were a blur of constant care, sleepless nights, and a sadness that seemed endless. My mother withered with each day, and I watched helplessly. Dr. Oswald would come regularly, adjust the medication for the pain, and teach me how to take better care of her. School became secondary. I would only go when some neighbor could stay with my mother. It was on one of those mornings, when I returned from the bakery with fresh bread, that I noticed something different. The house was too quiet. I ran to my mother's room and found her, so serene, so pale, so still. "Mom?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no response. I touched her face, and it was cold. Her chest no longer moved with the effort to breathe. She had passed during those few minutes when I was out. I collapsed beside the bed, crying as I had never cried before. I cried until my eyes burned, until my throat hurt, until I felt there were no more tears to shed. That's how Anthony found me when he came home hours later. He looked at my mother's body, then at me, and didn't say a word. He just picked up the phone and called Dr. Oswald. What happened next would be the beginning of the biggest nightmare of my life. A nightmare I couldn't have imagined, even in my darkest dreams. The hours after my mother's death passed like a bad dream. Dr. Oswald came, examined the body, and signed the death certificate. He gently squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Be strong, girl. Your mother is no longer suffering." Anthony remained distant, resolving practical matters with a coldness that frightened me. I didn't see a single tear in his eyes. The wake was organized in the chapel of the main church of Lakeside, the same church where years before my mother had married Anthony, full of hope for a better future. Now her body rested in a simple casket, surrounded by few flowers. We didn't have many friends in town. My mother's illness had isolated us even more in the last few years. Some neighbors appeared, murmuring words of comfort that couldn't penetrate the barrier of my pain. I sat on a bench in the first row, observing my mother's serene face. She finally seemed at peace, free from the suffering that had consumed her for so long. Anthony received the few present with that forced dignity, accepting condolences as if he were the only one suffering a loss. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to set, people started leaving. Soon, only Anthony, myself, and the funeral home employee who would keep watch during the night remained. Anthony approached and said in a controlled voice, "I'm going home to take a shower and bring something for us to eat. Do you want to come with me, or would you prefer to stay?" I couldn't bear the thought of leaving my mother, even knowing she wasn't there anymore. Not really. "I'll stay," I replied without looking at him. He nodded and left. The funeral home employee, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, brought me a glass of water and a more comfortable chair. "You need to rest a little," he said. "Your mother wouldn't want to see you like this, withering away." The hours passed slowly. I prayed, cried, remembered the happy moments with my mother, when she taught me to embroider, when she sang softly while cooking, when she told me stories before bed. At some point, exhausted by the weight of the grief, I fell asleep in the chair. I woke up startled with Anthony's hand on my shoulder. "Let's go home," he said. "The burial will be early tomorrow. You need to rest in a real bed." I looked one last time at the casket where my mother rested and reluctantly followed Anthony to the car. The night was cold, typical of Montana's winter, and the star-covered sky seemed indifferent to my pain. The journey home was made in silence. I was immersed in my thoughts, in my grief. Anthony drove concentratedly, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. When we arrived, I noticed something strange. He had stopped to buy more alcohol. Several bottles of whiskey were on the back seat. We entered the house that now seemed too big, too empty without my mother's presence. Even sick, she had been the heart of that place. Now, only an oppressive emptiness remained. "I'm going to take a shower and sleep," I said, heading towards the corridor that led to my room. "Wait." Anthony's voice sounded different, with an intonation I had never heard before. "We need to talk." I turned reluctantly. He was standing in the middle of the living room, an already opened bottle in his hand. His eyes had a strange gleam, almost feverish. "About what?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "About what happens now. About us." That word, us, came out of his mouth with a terrible weight. There was no us. There was him, my stepfather, and me, the daughter of the woman who had just died. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my voice firmer than I felt inside. "I'm tired, and tomorrow we have the burial." I turned my back and began to walk towards my room, but I heard his heavy steps behind me. Before I could react, I felt his hand grabbing my arm forcefully, turning me to face him. "You're not going anywhere until you listen to me," he growled, his breath heavy with alcohol hitting me full on. Fear paralyzed me. I had never seen that expression on his face before, a mixture of anger, desire, and something more disturbing that I couldn't name. "Your mother is gone," he continued, still holding my arm tightly. "She never gave me the son I wanted. Now it's your duty as a daughter to give me an heir. It's your duty to get pregnant by me." His words fell on me like a bucket of ice water. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was obscene, It was sick. My mother had barely gone cold in her casket, and he— "Let me go," I shouted, trying to free myself. "You're crazy. I'm your stepdaughter." He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "So what? We don't share the same blood. And you think I haven't seen how you look at me? How you walk around the house in those clothes?" I was horrified. The clothes he referred to were simple t-shirts and pants, nothing provocative. But in his distorted mind, in his sick desire, anything served as an excuse. "We're going to the bedroom now," he ordered, starting to drag me down the corridor. I fought with all the strength I had, scratching, pushing, trying to get loose. "No! Help! Someone help me!" I shouted, even knowing there was no one nearby to hear. He pushed me against the wall, his body pressing against mine, immobilizing me. "Nobody's going to hear you, Alice. Now it's just the two of us in this house. And you're going to do what I tell you." At that moment, I thought all was lost. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face, praying that it was just a nightmare from which I would wake up to find my mother alive, to return to our simple life in Riverdale before everything went wrong. That's when something unexpected happened. Strong knocks on the front door. They weren't polite knocks from neighbors or friends. They were decisive, authoritative blows. Anthony froze. For an instant, I saw something I had never seen in his eyes. Fear. "Who the hell?" he muttered, loosening his grip on my arm. I took advantage of the distraction to free myself and run away from him. The knocks continued, getting stronger and stronger. "Anthony, open this door right now!" A strong, determined female voice echoed from outside. His face paled. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "It can't be," he whispered. More knocking, stronger. "Anthony, I know you're in there. Open up or we'll break down the door." He looked at me, then at the door, undecided. Finally, staggering a bit from the alcohol and the surprise, he went to the entrance and opened it. Outside was a tall, middle-aged woman with a bearing that commanded respect. Her dark hair with gray strands was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, the same hazel tone as mine, sparkled with anger. Behind her, two large, strong men with serious expressions formed a kind of guard. "Helen," Anthony said, his voice suddenly weak. "What are you doing here?" Helen, the first wife. The woman my mother had talked about in her last days. I had never seen her before, but I recognized the name immediately. She didn't respond to Anthony. Instead, her penetrating eyes found mine, quickly assessing my state, the disheveled hair, the red marks on my arms where he had grabbed me, the tears on my face. "You must be Alice," she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. "Your mother called me 2 days ago, dear. She knew she was leaving. And she knew exactly the monster she was married to. She made me promise that, as soon as I heard the news of her death, I would come get you. My mother, my brave mother. Even on her deathbed, she had thought of me. She had plotted my salvation." I felt new tears, this time of gratitude mixed with the pain of loss. "You have no right to enter my house like this," Anthony said, trying to regain some authority. "Alice is my stepdaughter. She's under my guardianship now." Helen laughed, a cold sound cutting like steel. "Under your guardianship? The same way I was? The same way her mother was?" She took a step forward, confronting him without fear. "You think I don't know what happened to your other wives? To the other girls you tried to guard?" The two men behind her, who I later discovered were her brothers, also advanced, clearly ready to intervene if necessary. Anthony backed away, his bravado diminishing in the face of Helen's imposing presence and her companions. "This is none of your business," he muttered. "It is my business now," she responded firmly. Then she turned to me again. "Alice, get your things. Just the essentials. You're coming with us." I hesitated for a moment, looking from Helen to Anthony. I didn't know this woman, but my mother had trusted her. and anything would be better than staying there with him. "She's not going anywhere!" Anthony shouted, advancing towards me. That was his mistake. Helen's brothers moved with surprising speed for such large men. In seconds, they were between Anthony and me, blocking his path. "Touch her again, and it'll be the last thing you do," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. Anthony looked at the three, assessing his chances. Even drunk, he realized they were against him. "This won't end here," he growled. "She's underage. The police will come after you for kidnapping." Helen smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Then call them. Tell them how you tried to abuse your stepdaughter on the day of her mother's wake. I'm sure they'll be very interested." His face turned red with anger, but he didn't say anything else. "Alice," Helen called softly. "Go get your things, dear. We're waiting." I ran to my room, trembling with relief and fear. I grabbed a backpack and put in some clothes, the portrait of my mother that was on the bedside table, and some mementos I couldn't leave behind. Before leaving, I remembered my mother's little blue sewing notebook. I ran to the small room where she worked and found it, hidden among the fabrics. The notebook where she had written Helen's contact information. When I returned to the living room, Anthony was sitting on the sofa, his head in his hands. Helen and her brothers were standing, vigilant. Without saying a word, I went to Helen. "I'm ready," I said, my voice trembling slightly. She nodded and put a protective arm around my shoulders. "Let's go then." We left together into the cold night. A car was parked in front of the house. Helen guided me to the back seat and sat beside me while her brothers occupied the front seats. "Where are we going?" I asked, as the car began to move away from the only house I had known in recent years. "To my house in Star Valley for now," Helen replied. "Tomorrow, we'll go to your mother's burial. Afterward, we'll decide what to do. You're safe now, Alice. That's what matters." I looked through the rear window at the house that was getting smaller in the distance. Inside was the man who had almost destroyed my life. And somewhere, perhaps watching over me from another plane, was my mother, who even in her last moments had found a way to protect me. That night, I cried myself to sleep, for the mother I had lost and for the life that had almost been taken from me. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't crying out of fear. Helen's house in Star Valley was small but cozy, very different from the cold, impersonal mansion that Anthony maintained in Lakeside. Sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup of chamomile tea in my hands, I watched Helen preparing an improvised bed for me on the living room sofa. Her brothers Gerald and Tobias had already said goodbye, promising to return the next morning to take us to the burial. "Why did you come to get me?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. "You don't even know me." Helen stopped what she was doing and sat across from me. Her eyes, although tired, had a gentleness that reminded me of my mother. "I've known your mother for longer than you imagine, Alice," she replied. "Not personally at first. But I began to keep track of her from afar when I learned that Anthony had married again." She ran her hand through her gray hair, a gesture that denoted fatigue and painful memories. "I was his first wife, as you probably already know. 7 years of hell. When I finally managed to escape, I swore to myself that I would do everything possible to prevent him from destroying other women." "How did you manage to escape?" I asked, realizing there were many similarities between our stories. "My brothers," she answered with a small smile. "They always suspected Anthony, but I was too blind to see. When I finally told them what was happening, well, they came to get me, just as we did with you today." My stomach turned at the memory of what had happened hours before. Anthony, his hands grabbing me, his disgusting words. If Helen and her brothers hadn't arrived. "How did you know my mother had passed away?" I asked, trying to push those thoughts away. "Dorothy called me 2 days ago," Helen explained, confirming what she had already mentioned at Anthony's house. "She knew she didn't have much time. She told me about the illness, about how Anthony had changed, about the looks he was giving you." She paused, as if choosing her words. Your mother was a much stronger woman than she appeared, Alice. She endured so much for you. Tears began to stream down my face. But why didn't she run away before? Why didn't she take me out of that house when she realized what he was like? Helen sighed. Fear does terrible things to us. It paralyzes us, makes us believe there's no way out. And in your mother's case, the illness complicated everything. She depended on him for the treatments, for the medicines. I nodded, understanding better now why my mother had endured so much. How did you meet her in person? After she called me the first time, a few months ago, I began to visit her when Anthony traveled. We had been planning to get you two out of there, but her health deteriorated rapidly. Helen extended her hand across the table and held mine. Her last request was that I promise to save you, Alice, and I promised. More tears. My mother, even dying, had thought of my safety. She had plotted my salvation behind the scenes, knowing she wouldn't be there to protect me. That night, lying on Helen's living room sofa with a warm blanket over me, I couldn't sleep. My mind was filled with images. My mother withering away in the hospital, Anthony cornering me against the wall, Helen appearing like a guardian angel at the door, and mainly the image of my mother's corpse, serene in the casket, not knowing that her final plan had worked perfectly. The next morning, we dressed in black and went to the lakeside cemetery. My heart was racing at the thought of seeing Anthony again, but Helen assured me that her brothers wouldn't let him get near me. The burial was simple and quick. To my surprise, Anthony didn't show up. Later, Helen told me that he was probably afraid to face her brothers again, or perhaps feared that I would tell someone what had happened. Only a few people attended: Dr. Oswald, 2 elderly neighbors, and a couple I vaguely recognized as old friends of my parents from Riverdale. I stood there, in front of the casket being lowered into the earth, feeling completely lost. What would become of me now? Where would I go? What would I do with my life? After the ceremony, when everyone had already left, I stayed a few more minutes in front of the freshly closed grave. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered. "You saved me. I promise I'll be strong, as you asked." When we returned to Helen's house, a strange feeling came over me. A mixture of relief for being away from Anthony and a profound emptiness from the loss of my mother. I sat on the small back porch, observing the well-kept yard where some chickens lazily pecked the ground. That's when I had a breakdown. All the tension, all the fear, all the pain I had been holding back exploded at once. I began to shake uncontrollably, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. Helen came running, alarmed by my screams. "Alice, what's wrong?" she asked, kneeling beside me and hugging me. "I don't know what to do now," I managed to say between sobs. "I don't have anyone anymore. I have nowhere to go. I don't have money. I haven't finished school." Helen hugged me tighter, gently rocking me as if I were a small child. "Shh, it's okay. You have me now. You can stay here as long as you need." Those words, spoken with such conviction, were like a balm for my wounded soul. But a part of me still doubted, still feared. "Why?" I asked, pulling away to look her in the eyes. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." She smiled, a sad smile. "Because no one did this for me when I was your age. Because your mother asked me to, and because it's the right thing to do." She dried my tears with her thumbs. "Besides, I'm not offering charity, Alice. I'm offering a chance. A chance to start over, to build your own life away from his shadow." That night, I had a terrible nightmare. I dreamed I was back at the house in Lakeside, that Anthony had found me, that he was dragging me to the bedroom while I screamed for help. I woke up screaming, bathed in cold sweat. Helen came running from her bed and found me on the sofa, curled up like a wounded animal. "It was just a dream," she murmured, sitting beside me and holding my hand. "He can't hurt you now." But we both knew that wasn't true. Anthony was still a threat. He knew where Helen lived. He could come after me at any moment. "I need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Far away." to a place where he can never find me. Helen remained silent for a few moments, thoughtful. I have a sister in Minneapolis, she said finally. She has a boarding house for young women. Perhaps you could stay there for a while, resume your studies. The idea of starting over in a big city where Anthony wouldn't easily find me was tempting. But the fear was still there, deeply rooted. What if he looks for me there? What if he discovers where I am? Helen squeezed my hand. He won't. My brothers will have a serious talk with him tomorrow. And besides, you'll be surrounded by other people. You won't be alone. The next morning, while we were having breakfast, Helen presented me with a more detailed plan. Her sister, Zenobia, ran a boarding house for female students and workers in Minneapolis, near Independence Avenue. It was a safe place, well located, where I could stay while resuming my studies. "We can go tomorrow if you want," she said. I called Zenobia last night, and she said she has a vacant room. The idea of leaving so quickly frightened me, and at the same time gave me hope. But how will I pay? I don't have money. "Your mother left something for you," Helen said, getting up and going to a cabinet in the living room. She returned with an envelope. "She gave me this the last time we met. She said it was for you, for a fresh start." I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, there was a modest sum of money, probably my mother's lifetime savings, and a small gold brooch in the shape of a bird that I immediately recognized. It was a family heirloom, which my grandmother had given to my mother on the day of her marriage to my father. With it, there was a note written in my mother's delicate handwriting, already a bit shaky from the illness. "My dear Alice, if you are reading this, it's because I am no longer there to protect you. Forgive me for not being strong enough to get us out of that situation earlier. Forgive me for not being able to see you grow and become the wonderful woman I know you will be. This money isn't much, but I hope it's enough for a new beginning. And the brooch, keep it with care as a reminder that no matter where I am, I will always be watching over you. With all my love, Mom." The tears came again, but this time there was something different about them, a determination, a resolution. My mother had done everything possible to give me a chance to escape, to start over. I couldn't waste it. "I'll go to Minneapolis," I told Helen, wiping away the tears. "I'll start over. I'll study, work, build a life that would make my mother proud." Helen smiled, a smile of true happiness. "That's the right decision, Alice, and know that you won't be alone. I'll always be around, as will Zenobia and the other girls at the boarding house." That night, as I packed the small backpack with the few things I had brought from Anthony's house, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Fear of the unknown, sadness for the loss of my mother, but also, for the first time in a long time, a small glimmer of hope. Before sleeping, I looked through Helen's living room window at the starry sky of rural Montana. Somewhere up there, I imagined, my mother would be watching over me, satisfied to know that her last and most desperate plan had worked, that I was safe, ready to start a new life away from Anthony's clutches. "Thank you," I whispered to the stars, "for everything." The next day, we would board the first bus to Minneapolis, leaving behind the nightmare that had almost destroyed my life. Ahead of me, an uncertain future, but mine. Just mine. The journey to Minneapolis was long and silent. Sitting next to Helen on the interstate bus, I watched the scenery change, the open fields of the countryside gradually giving way to the suburbs and finally to the tall buildings of the capital. Every mile that distanced us from Lakeside was like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. When we arrived at the Minneapolis bus terminal, it was already late afternoon. Helen, who knew the city well, guided us to a taxi stand. "Zenobia's boarding house is in the East Side neighborhood, near East Hennepin Avenue," she explained to the driver, who nodded and put our few bags in the trunk. The boarding house was an old but well-preserved two-story building, with a soft yellow facade and large windows. When we arrived, Zenobia was already waiting for us at the door. It was amazing how the two sisters resembled each other. The same erect posture, the same hazel eyes, the same determined expression. But while Helen had something rustic about her, a countrywoman, Zenobia had a more urban air, with her hair cut short and more modern clothes. "So this is Alice," she said, examining me with kind eyes. "Welcome, dear. Helen told me your story. You are safe here." The room assigned to me was small, but clean and cozy. A single bed, a wardrobe, a simple desk under the window that overlooked an inner courtyard where some clothes were drying on clotheslines. I would share the bathroom at the end of the corridor with 3 other young women, all students or workers. "Tomorrow, I'll introduce you to the other girls," Zenobia said as she showed me the room. "They all have their stories, their reasons for being here. We respect each other's privacy, but we also form a small family. No one is alone." Helen stayed only that night, sleeping in Zenobia's room. The next morning, before leaving, she hugged me tightly and said, "You have courage, Alice. More than you imagine. You'll do well here." Then lower, almost a whisper, "If he shows up, if you hear anything about him looking for you, let me know immediately. My brothers are keeping him under surveillance in Lakeside, but you never know." The first days at the boarding house were strange. It was as if I were floating between 2 worlds, the nightmare I had left behind, and a new reality that didn't yet seem fully mine. The other girls were kind, but I kept my distance. Fear had become so deeply rooted in me that it was difficult to trust. Zenobia, noticing my isolation, suggested that I go back to school. "You finished junior high, right? You can do high school at night school and then take the college entrance exams if you want. Meanwhile, maybe you could work part-time to help with expenses." The idea of having a purpose, of building something for myself, was like a balm. Soon, I established a routine. In the morning, I worked as an attendant at a stationery store near the boarding house. In the afternoon, I attended night school. In the evening, I studied in my small room, listening to the news of the country and the popular songs on the radio. Weeks became months, and months, years. Slowly, the open wound from my mother's death and the terror experienced with Anthony began to heal. It didn't disappear. It would never completely disappear, but it became something I could carry without it destroying me. In 1974, 4 years after my arrival in Minneapolis, I took the entrance exam for psychology. It wasn't a random choice. During those years, I had observed how many of the girls who passed through Zenobia's boarding house carried traumas similar to mine. Domestic violence, abandonment, abuse of all kinds. I wanted to better understand human suffering, not only to make sense of my own, but to perhaps one day be able to help others through their pain. To my surprise and joy, I was accepted. When I received the news, Zenobia hugged me with tears in her eyes. "Your mother would be so proud," she said. I cried too, thinking about how my mother had sacrificed everything, including her own life, to give me this chance. It was in college that I met Thomas. He was a law student, a few years older than me, with a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to see through people. We met at the Central Library when we were both looking for the same books for different assignments. What began as academic collaboration soon turned into friendship and eventually into something more. At first, I was afraid. Every time Thomas came close, every time his touch brushed my skin, my entire body would stiffen. Memories of Anthony would invade my mind. But Thomas was patient. "I'm in no hurry," he would say. "We have all the time in the world." One day, I finally told him my whole story. We were sitting on a bench in Loring Park, watching couples walking hand in hand, children running after kites. I spoke of my father's death, of my mother's marriage to Anthony, of the years of fear and tension, of the illness that consumed my mother, of the horror of that night after the wake. I spoke of Helen, of Zenobia, of the escape to Minneapolis. I spoke of everything, hiding nothing. When I finished, I was exhausted, as if I had run a marathon. I looked at Thomas, expecting to see disgust, pity, or worse, disbelief in his eyes. but all I saw was compassion and deep respect. He took my hand, gently, without any pressure, and said, "Thank you for trusting me with your story. You are the bravest person I've ever met." At that moment, something broke inside me. Not in a bad way, but like a dam that finally gives way, releasing long-held waters. I cried as I hadn't cried since my mother's death, but they were different tears, not just of pain, but also of relief, of liberation. Thomas hugged me as I cried, and for the first time I didn't feel afraid of his touch. On the contrary, I felt safe, anchored, and I knew then that despite all the scars, I was still capable of loving and being loved. Our relationship progressed slowly, respecting my timing and my fears. Thomas never pressured me, never demanded more than I could give. And gradually, I relearned how to trust, to open up, to live without the constant fear that had been my companion for so many years. In 1978, when I was in my last year of college, Thomas asked me to marry him. It was something simple, without grand gestures or dramatic declarations. We were having dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the boarding house when he said, "Alice, I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me?" I said yes, without hesitation. And that same year, we got married in a simple ceremony at the courthouse with Zenobia, Helen, and some friends from the boarding house as witnesses. We didn't have much money. I was still studying, and Thomas had just graduated. But we were happy in our small rented apartment in the East Bank neighborhood. As for Anthony, I never saw him again. Helen told me, years later, that he had sold everything in Lakeside and moved to Wyoming. "It's better this way," she said, "far enough away not to worry." And that's how I freed myself from the clutches of that man who almost destroyed my life. It wasn't all at once. It wasn't in a single heroic moment. It was a slow, painful process, full of relapses and moments of despair. But step by step, with the help of people who truly cared about me, Helen, Zenobia, Thomas, I managed to rebuild my life from the ashes. And throughout it all, I felt my mother's presence. Not as a ghost, but as a gentle force guiding my steps. Her final act of love, contacting Helen, planning my escape, had given me a second chance, a chance I was determined not to waste. Today, at 73 years old, I live once again in Lakeside, the same town where I experienced the nightmare that almost destroyed my life. Returning here wasn't an easy decision. For many years, I avoided even mentioning the name of this town, as if the syllables themselves could conjure back the terror. But time has this curious power to transform places, just as it transforms people. After Thomas retired from law practice in 2015, we talked about where we would like to spend our golden years. We had lived in Minneapolis for more than 4 decades, built our life there, put down deep roots. But something in me yearned for a cycle that needed to be closed. "I want to go back to Lakeside," I told Thomas one night, surprising us both. "I want to face that place not as a frightened girl, but as the woman I've become." Thomas, with his usual understanding, simply squeezed my hand and said, "If that's what you want, we'll go together." Oh, and so, after almost half a century, I returned to the town that had been the stage for the darkest chapter of my story. But this time, I returned by choice, not by obligation. I returned as a retired psychologist, not as a helpless orphan. I returned with Thomas by my side, a man who taught me that not all male touches carry violence. Our house is in the new part of town, far from the house where I lived with my mother and Anthony. It's a modest but comfortable house with a porch from where I can see the Flathead River winding in the distance. I have my special corner where I still receive some women for therapeutic conversations. I don't charge for these sessions. They're my way of giving back all the help I received throughout my life. Helen visited us a few times before passing away in 2018 at 92 years old, a strong woman until the end. Zenobia, unfortunately, left us earlier, in 2011. Both were fundamental pillars in my story of overcoming, and not a day goes by that I don't thank them for finding me. Thomas and I didn't have children, a conscious choice we made together. The traumas of the past left deep marks, and I felt that my contribution to the world would be better through my profession, helping others overcome their own pain. Instead of biological children, we have dozens of young people who passed through our lives. Interns I guided at the university, clients who became friends, nieces and nephews we treat as if they were our own. The routine of our days is peaceful. I wake up early, prepare some coffee, and sit on the porch to watch the sunrise. Thomas, who has always been a sleepyhead, joins me later, bringing fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. We talk about the small things in life, read the newspapers, plan the day. 3 times a week, I receive women in my therapeutic corner, many of them victims of domestic violence, referred by the Women's Reference Center in town. I don't do formal therapy, my professional license is inactive, but I offer an attentive ear and guidance based not only on the books I studied, but on the life I lived. "You really understand what I'm going through," a young woman once told me, surprised by the accuracy with which I had captured her feelings. I didn't tell her my story, I rarely do, but just smiled and said, "Pain has a universal language, my dear. Those who have spoken this language recognize its dialects." On weekends, Thomas and I walk around town. Lakeside has changed a lot since the 70s. It has grown, modernized, become more open and vibrant. Sometimes we pass by the old house where I lived with my mother and Anthony. It has been renovated and painted blue, now home to a young family. I see children playing in the same yard where my mother used to plant her daisies, and I feel a strange peace. Places don't carry evil. It's the people who inhabit them that determine their energy. Once a month, I go to the cemetery to visit my mother's grave. I bring daisies, her favorite flowers, and talk to her silently, telling her about my life, about the women I've been helping, about the town that is now a place of healing, not pain. I feel that she hears me and is happy to see that her final sacrifice was not in vain. Life has taught me that the scars we carry don't completely disappear, but we can choose to transform them into a source of strength and wisdom. Each woman I help find her voice, escape an abusive relationship, rebuild her self-esteem, is a tribute to my mother and to all the women who helped me rebuild my own life. And when I look back at that terrible night after my mother's wake, I don't just see the horror that almost swallowed me, but also the miracle that saved me, the final act of love from a mother who, even knowing she wouldn't be there to protect me, found a way to ensure my safety. This is the message I carry with me and share with all who come to me seeking comfort. Hope can be born even in the most unlikely places, and sometimes it's precisely our deepest wounds that enable us to help others heal theirs. You know, my dear ones, after all these years, I've learned that the greatest power we have is not to forget the past, but to transform it into something that makes sense, that has purpose. Each scar we carry can become a bridge to reach someone who is still on the other side of pain, lost, and without hope. If you're going through a dark moment now, if you feel the walls are closing in around you, I want you to know, you are not alone, and more importantly, you don't need to face this alone. Help can come from the most unexpected places, as it came for me through Helen, the ex-wife of the man who almost destroyed my life. One of the most precious lessons I've learned is that we should always seek help. Shame wants to keep us isolated, wants to convince us that we're the only ones, that no one will believe us, that no one will understand. But that's a lie. There are good people in this world, people who extend a hand without asking for anything in return, people who believe in us when we don't even believe in ourselves. Another lesson I carry with me is that time truly is a great ally. Not that it heals all wounds, some are too deep to completely close, but it gives us the necessary distance to look at our traumas not as paralyzed victims, but as survivors in motion. And perhaps the most important of all lessons, violence is never the victim's fault. Never. No matter what they say, no matter how they try to distort reality, no one deserves to be abused, humiliated, or violated. And no one, Absolutely no one has the right to use their power or position to hurt another person. Today, when I receive these women in my home, when I see in their eyes the same fear that once inhabited mine, I tell them what I wish someone had told me when I was young. Your story doesn't end here. This painful chapter doesn't define who you are or who you can become. And you deserve a life free from fear, a life where you can breathe deeply, sleep in peace, and dream without nightmares. God knows it wasn't an easy path to get here. There were days when I woke up screaming, nights when the nightmare seemed so real that Thomas had to hold me for hours until I stopped trembling. There were moments when guilt consumed me, guilt for having survived when my mother didn't, guilt for not having been strong enough to face him before, guilt for feeling that somehow I had attracted that evil to my life. But guilt, like fear, loses its power when brought to light. When we share our stories, when we allow others to walk with us in our pain, something miraculous happens. We realize that we're not broken beyond repair. We're just in the process of rebuilding. And you, my dear ones, who have listened to me until here, perhaps because you saw something of your own story in mine, perhaps because you know someone who is experiencing something similar, or perhaps simply because your heart opened to this grandma here, I want to ask something very important. If this story touched your heart, if these words lit some light within you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell now. Don't wait another minute. Each subscription is a way of saying, I'm listening. These stories matter. These voices need to be amplified. And we need to create a support network, a community where these stories can circulate, touching other lives, saving other hearts. And leave me a comment with the word liberation. I want to know who stayed with me until the end, who embraced this entire journey. Your comments are like a virtual hug that I receive with gratitude. I end with the same phrase I use when saying goodbye to the women I counsel. Life is not always fair, but we are stronger than we imagine, and together we are invincible. God bless you, my dear ones. Until next time.